Welcome to our video on how to install the headsets and handlebars on a brand new Catrike 559. Before we get started, let's talk about the handlebar and stem parts. This is the stem, and attached to it is the handlebar. Welded onto the handlebar is a post that holds the wrist rest. There's also the brake levers and the shift levers on the very top, and one of the two stems has the mirror post attached to it. Now let's talk about the mirror post. In North America, Catrike sends the Trikes out with the mirror post mounted on the left handlebar assembly. There's nothing on the right. However, you can order a second mirror post from Catrike that is the opposite curve, so you can attach a second mirror on the right hand side of the Trike. Another way to identify which is right and which is the left handlebar and stem assembly is with the shifters. The right shifter is indexed and is for the rear derailleur. The left shifter is smooth running and has no indexing, and it is for the front derailleur. Now that we know which is which, it's time to figure out the headset assembly and which is the right and which is the left. The two are different. First off, there is all the bearing assembly that makes up the headset itself, and it fits in the head tube on the frame. Then there's an arm that sticks out that I like to call the steering arm, and in the steering arm there are two holes. One holds the tie rod, and the small hole holds the speed transducer. There's also the caliper brake assemblies that we see there as well. Now there are a few ways to figure out which assembly is for what side of the trike. One of the ways is using the tie rod attachment point, or those little arms that stick out of the steering assembly. They face one another and the tie rod fits into them. Now the tie rod is behind the headset area on the trike, so you have to be aware that the tie rod fits aft of the headset assembly. Another way to figure out which steering column assembly is for what side of the trike is by using the brake caliper assembly location on the steering arm. In the case of the right steering assembly, the caliper is located underneath the steering arm. On the left side of the trike, the caliper assembly sits on top of the steering arm. And just like using the tie rod, we must remember that the headset is forward of the steering assembly. And the final way to figure out what side is which is by using the speedometer transducer arm. This is where your speed transducer for your computer assembly gets hooked to, but it can easily be put into the other steering column arm, so I find it's a less accurate way to do this. However, at this time, Catrike is shipping the speedo arm on the left assembly. Now let's talk about what you're going to need to have to do this. You're going to need the frame, and that's the headset tube. Pressed into the top and bottom are cups. These cups allow the bearings to sit up against them in their angled portion. You might have seen one of these tools at your local Trike store. It's actually a commercial press to press in headsets as well as bottom brackets, and is a very good tool and aligns things very well. There's also another tool available for a home mechanic that's a press and does the same sort of thing, but isn't as accurate. Most bike manufacturers will actually have a heavy-duty press. What they do is they install the cups in the top and bottom of the press starts to come together, and everything's perfectly aligned, hopefully. Then it's all pressed down, nice and tight, and then finally the frame is removed. If done correctly, the two cups are perfectly in alignment with one another and tied up against the frame. Also, in the process of putting this together, we're going to need the steering assembly for the left-hand side in this particular case, including the brake caliper. We're also going to need the handlebar and stem assembly for the left-hand side of the trike as well. And, of course, all the other parts are on it, like the shifter, the brake lever, and, of course, the wrist rest. As we take a look at the headset itself, we're going to notice the first part right down here. It's called the crown race. It's also another part that gets pressed on, and the bearing sits right on top of it. We want to make sure that the crown race is not damaged in any way, so take a good look at it. The center of the bearing is actually a larger diameter than the shaft it fits on. However, once it comes down on top of the crown race, it's held solid. Most bearings are designed to be pushed in this direction, not this direction. These bearings, because the shoulders on the sides actually allow that top to bottom compression, Catrike has actually chosen to provide a Teflon bushing on the top instead of a second bearing for the top surface. I believe it provides resistance in the steering system and makes the trike less likely to go darting into the ditch when you're not paying attention. It slides up underneath the FSA dust cover, and between the FSA dust cover and the top cap and bolt assembly fits the stem. Now, the stem and handlebar assembly go on all at the same time, and these two bolts must be loosened before the stem is slid into place on this shaft. Once it has been, the top cap is replaced, the top bolt is done up, and the whole thing is snugged up till it stops moving in the head tube of the frame itself. To do this, you're going to need a 5mm Allen key. Now, some people will just keep tightening this till they get rid of the wobble, and that's when they stop. My personal preference is to actually torque the M6 bolt on the top to the correct standards. I use a socket on a ratcheting torque wrench. In this particular case, I'm using a Park Tools TW-5 ratcheting torque wrench. Now, the drive mechanism on the end of it is for a 1/4-inch drive, but Park Tools supplies this step-up adapter to go from 1/4-inch to 3/8, so it'll fit my socket. Some people use Loctite to lock the M6 bolt on the top of the spindle assembly to compress the headset into place. My personal preference is I don't. I just check it every once in a while. Now, it is possible to replace the Teflon bushing with the same bearing as on the bottom of the whole headset. You can buy a second bearing to replace this bushing from Catrike, and it will work for the top. However, one thing you do need to do is there's a small shoulder here which is part of the bearing system, and if you just put it on the shaft, it'll actually wobble around. What you're going to need is you're going to need a compression ring. This particular compression ring perfectly fits onto the bearing and stops any wobble of the bearing on the shaft. Now, this isn't some funky arrangement that I've created myself. This is how most headsets on bicycles work. They have a top and bottom bearing and a compression ring on the top that stops wobbling on the shaft. This particular compression ring is from Catrike, catrike.com, and the part number is AAA0002R. Now, word of warning, if you buy the compression ring from Catrike, they will send it internationally by UPS, and UPS will charge you huge brokerage and it'll quadruple the price of this ring. Call Catrike and get them to send it directly to you using post. Now let's begin the installation process of the bearings. The first step is to lubricate the two cups that are press fit into the frame. To do this, I use PPL1 or Polylube 1000 by Park. It's my go-to grease for these type of jobs. Now, the reason I'm putting a small amount of this lubrication on the inside of the cups is to stop a problem of gilding between dissimilar metals. Gilding is what happens when the two metals go together and it creates a fusing or a welding action as the two metals react to one another and create corrosion that ends up sticking together. So to stop this, we use a small amount of lubrication. The next step in the process is we need to inspect the parts before we start to install them. Inspect the crown race to make sure that there's no dings, dents, or damage, and make sure it's not crooked. It's very important. My first Trike arrived to me with a badly damaged and very crooked crown race, which would have destroyed the bearing in short order. Next, inspect the shaft and the top of the shaft to make sure that there's no damage to it. The parts can slide on it freely, and nothing will actually damage any of the parts. It's very important to check to make sure everything is in good order. Inside of the shaft is something called a star nut, and it's been pressed down in there. The star nut is used when we put the M6 bolt in the top of the system to compress it all down, and the star nut must sit in there square and at just the right depth so that the bolt will go in. If it's too deep, the bolt won't work, and if it's not in there at all, the bolt won't go in. Now let's start the fun part. Let's install the headset and the handlebar assembly. First off, you have to remove the M6 bolt on the top and the top cap. Then remove the FSA dust cover or cover. Then remove the Teflon bushing that is supplied by Catrike, as well as the little spacer on the very top of it. That little spacer is very important. Next, insert the stem into the bottom of the headset tube. The bottom bearing shoulder must be facing upwards and will perfectly match the shape of the cup on the bottom of the headset tube. If you're going to use the supplied Teflon bushing from Catrike, here's how to install it. The bushing has a shoulder exactly the same as the bearing on the bottom. But this time the shoulder must face downwards, not up like on the bearing on the bottom. Insert the Teflon bushing completely down inside of the cup. After that, put in the little metal spacer. And finally goes the FSA dust cover on the very top, which pinches everything together. Once all that's together and we put the stem and the top cap and the M6 bolt on top, everything will stop moving. However, in this particular case, we're not going to use the Teflon bushing and little metal spacer on the very top. Instead, we're going to replace the top system with the same bearing that's found on the bottom of the headset and the Catrike compression ring. If you decide to do this, the process is actually very simple and not complicated at all. Simply take the second bearing with its shoulders facing downwards. This has the same shoulders that our Teflon bushing had, and they must perfectly match into the cup shape on the top of the headset tube. Once that's in and you push it down, you can actually move the stem within the bearing system. That's why this Catrike compression ring is so important, to stop that movement and hold everything snug. For all intents and purposes, this little Catrike compression ring is like the crown race on the bottom of the headset. It also has a little angled side to it, and that angle must face downwards and firmly plant into the center of the bearing. Next in the process, we put the FSA dust cover on the top. Now you might be thinking to yourself that we also need that little spacer that Catrike provided, and I'm going to show you exactly what happens if you do actually put that on. If you put the spacer on, and it's not required or necessary, this is what's going to happen. Place the spacer on the top and make sure it's down against the compression ring. Next, reinstall the FSA dust cover or cap. And when you do, what you'll find is there's going to be a gap between the rubber on the bottom of the FSA cover and the headset cup itself. So adding the spacer on top of the compression ring is not the way to go and will not work. Only the compression ring is required to make all this work. So now we're going to reinstall the FSA dust cap, but if it comes apart like this, it's simply a rubber washer down inside of a metal groove. So simply push her back down. The center of this dust cover is actually what pushes on top of the compression ring, and the rubber part makes a seal on the outside of the cups in the headset itself. Once you've put it back on, what you'll actually find is that you can let go of everything, but slowly but surely the spindle will fall down. Now it's time to install the handlebar and stem assembly on the spindle. Hopefully you've already loosened the 2 bolts on the stem so that the stem will slide on easily onto the spindle. Sometimes it takes a little bit of alignment, but eventually it'll go on. It's fairly loose at this point. Then grab the top cap and the M6 bolt and place it into the center of the stem. Now what will actually happen is you're going into the star nut and just tighten it up by hand. At this point, nothing can fall apart anymore. The whole system cannot drop out, and that little M6 bolt stops everything from moving. Now hand tighten the M6 bolt with your 5mm Allen key until it comes to a stop. At this point, you have 2 options. There is some play in the headset. You could simply use your 5mm Allen key and snug this up. Or you can use your torque wrench. There's another thing to consider at this point as well, and that is the angle of the stem and handlebar assembly. Unfortunately, at this point in the installation process, we don't know what angle it's going to be at. So all we can do is tighten up the bolt on the top of the whole assembly to its proper torque spec. Catrike says it should be to 10 inch-pounds, which is 1.13 newton meters. We tighten between 1 and 1.2 because there is no 1.13 newton meters on our torque wrench. We found that 1.2 seems to be the perfect tension for this particular part. And all you simply do is you keep going along until you get the click, and then you stop. It's that simple. The next part of the process would be to tighten up the stem. Now the stem should be tightened to 8 newton meters. At this point, because the top bolt, the M6 bolt, has been tightened down properly, there's no slop and the headset works perfectly. You may choose to wait to tighten up the stem bolts until you've properly aligned the handlebar assembly, which we'll talk about in a later video. And at this point, if you do tighten up the 2 stem bolts, it won't damage anything. So tighten them up to 8 newton meters and you'll be fine. Let's do a quick review. Start off by checking the crown race at the bottom of the spindle. Then check the side of the spindle and the top. Next, check the star nut on the inside to make sure it's not crooked and that it's the proper height from the top. Then place the bearing over top of the spindle and make sure it slides down all the way and is completely seated on top of the crown race. There must not be any space whatsoever. Next, place the whole unit inside of the frame headset tube and make sure that the bearing perfectly seats into the bottom of the cup on the bottom of the headset tube. Next, either use the Teflon bushing that is supplied by Catrike or replace it with a bearing and compression ring assembly. Make sure if you do use the compression ring assembly, make sure it's all the way down and seated perfectly in the center of the bearing. Next, after that goes the FSA dust cover or dust cap. Next, we install the stem. Make sure the two stem bolts are completely loose before installing it. Next, place the top cap on top of the spindle and make sure it's nice and tight against the stem. Next, insert the M6 bolt through the top cap and into the star nut inside the spindle, making sure it has good purchase. Tighten with a 5mm Allen wrench until the M6 bolt is hand tight. Then assemble your torque wrench and tighten the top bolt to 1.2 Newton meters. Once you've done that, reset your torque wrench to 8 Newton meters and tighten the two stem bolts. My preference is to do one little bit and then the next little bit and then the next until finally the torque wrench goes click. A word on your torque wrench: when you're not using it, make sure it's dialed down to 0 or it will start to be less accurate. Thank you so much for watching this video on how to install headset and handlebars on a Catrike 559. Our triking series has 9 parts, and within each part is multiple episodes. The episode you just watched was part of our assembly of a Catrike 559 video series. Please let us know if what we're offering is useful or not. We always appreciate nice comments or suggestions on how we can do things better. Anyways, thanks again for watching. See you out in the trail.